Her millionaire ex kicked her out with one suitcase, but he was stunned by her glow and elegance at his son's school board meeting. There's a special kind of pain that comes from being thrown away by someone who was sure you'd fall apart without them. The kind that makes people whisper, judge, and wait for your life to collapse on schedule. But sometimes the person they counted out walks back in so steady, so put together, it ruins the whole story they told about her. Jane looked across that school boardroom and said, "You didn't throw me away, Nolan. You just lost your place in my life. So let me ask you this. How many people confuse your silence with weakness when really you're just rebuilding in private?" Before we dive in, my older sister is convinced I can't build a massive family here on YouTube. Let's show her the power of this community. Hit that subscribe button right now. Takes half a second but brings us closer together. Let us know your state or country in the comments. Now sit back and enjoy the story. Tonight, a man who once sent his wife out with one suitcase is about to learn that some women don't break. They rebuild. Jane still remembered the sound of that suitcase rolling down the driveway. One wheel was messed up. It made the stubborn little click every few feet. Click, drag, click, drag. It was the cheapest thing in sight, which almost felt funny considering the house behind her looked like it had been built to impress strangers. The tall iron gate, the clean stone steps, the black car parked under the covered drive, the fountain out front that ran day and night like water bills were for other people. Jane stood there with one suitcase, her coat half-buttoned, and her whole life suddenly reduced to whatever she had thrown together in less than an hour. Upstairs, a small hand hit the bedroom window. "Mom!" Her son's voice came through the glass faint and broken. Jane looked up so fast it made her neck ache. Eli was only 9 then. Small face, big eyes, both palms pressed to the window like maybe if he pushed hard enough, he could stop what was happening. For one dumb second, she thought Nolan would come to his senses. Maybe he would walk down the steps. Maybe he would say they were both angry and this had gone too far. Maybe he would remember there was a child in the house. Instead, Nolan stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, his face flat and cool, like they were discussing a change in travel plans. "You need time to think," he said. Jane stared at him. "Time to think?" "Yes. You're putting me out. I'm asking you to step away until you calm down." Jane let out one short laugh because the lie was so clean it almost deserved applause. "I am calm. You haven't been calm for days." "No. I've been honest for days." Nolan's jaw moved once. Not much. Just enough for her to know she had landed where it hurt. The fight had started over a phone call he thought she didn't hear. One of those private calls he took in his office with the door almost closed. He had been talking to a board member at Hawthorne Academy about Eli's placement for the next school year. Not just asking questions. Not just checking in. Leaning on people. Making things happen because he knew how to make people nervous. He wanted Eli placed in an advanced track run by a director Jane had already flagged as cold, careless, and obsessed with image. Jane had said the program would crush a child who needed room to breathe. Nolan said breathing was not the goal. Winning was. That turned into another fight, which turned into old fights, which turned into Jane finally saying the thing she had been swallowing for years. "You treat everything like it belongs to you. The house, the schedule, the school, the child. Me." Nolan had gone quiet after that. That was always worse than yelling. He never threw things. Never slammed doors. Never did the kind of wild, messy damage people could point to later. He did calm damage. The kind that made you sound dramatic if you tried to explain it. Now he looked at her like a man who had already decided what story would be told. "You can stay with your friend for a few days," he said. "We both know you need perspective." Jane's hand tightened around the suitcase handle. "What am I supposed to tell Eli?" Nolan looked up toward the window for half a second, then back at her. "Tell him his mother needed space." Jane felt something cold settle in her chest. Not panic. Not yet. Something clearer. He was going to do this. He was really going to stand there in that expensive sweater and hand her a lie to give their son while acting like he was the reasonable one. "Open the door," she said. "I want to say goodbye to him." Nolan didn't move. "It's better if we keep this clean." She took one step toward the house. That is my child. And this is exactly what I mean. You're upset. You're making everything worse. Jane stopped because she knew that tone. He used it in meetings, with waiters, with assistants, with anyone he wanted to shrink without raising his voice. Measured. Calm. Just concerned enough to make other people question the woman in the room. The front door stayed open. The house lights glowed behind him. Eli was still upstairs, crying so hard now she could hear it when the wind shifted. Jane. She hated the way he said her name in moments like this, like he was the only adult in the room. If you care about Eli, don't turn this into a scene. She looked past him at the hallway inside that house. The framed art she had picked. The runner she had chosen for the stairs. The warm lamp in the entry that she bought because Nolan once said the place looked too cold at night. Every piece of it had her hands on it. And still he stood there like he owned the whole story. Jane swallowed and stepped back. Not because she agreed. Because she had learned that men like Nolan loved it when you broke exactly where they expected. She lifted her chin and looked straight at him. One day, she said quietly, you're going to realize what this cost. He didn't answer. That hurt too. Not because he had a clever comeback. Because he didn't think he needed one. Jane turned and walked down the driveway with the suitcase clicking beside her. Click, drag, click, drag. At the gate, she looked back once. Eli was still at the upstairs window. She pressed a hand to her chest and mouthed, I love you. Then she walked out. 6 years later, Jane stood outside the Hawthorne Academy administration building with a leather folder under one arm and pearl earrings. She almost left it home. The building was red brick. Nothing special. Glass doors. Neat hedges. A flagpole out front leaning just a little to the left like nobody had wanted to pay to fix it. But her stomach was tight in a way that had nothing to do with the place itself. This meeting mattered. Not because of Nolan. Because of what she had built after him. Inside, the district board was meeting with parent leaders and school partners to review a proposal for expanded arts and literacy work. Hawthorne called it a community partnership meeting. Jane called it what it really was. A power struggle with coffee and name tags. Her program, Bright Pages, had started in a church basement with folding tables, old books, and a handful of kids who had already learned to act like school wasn't for them. 3 years later, it ran in 4 schools and 1 public library. Teachers loved it. Parents fought to get their kids in. Kids who once refused to read out loud now argued over who got to go first. That should have been what Jane was thinking about. Her numbers, her pitch, her slides. Instead, she was thinking about the text her son had sent 20 minutes earlier. You'll do great. Also, Dad is here already. No emoji. No extra words. That was Eli. Straight to the point. Jane let out a slow breath and pushed open the front door. The lobby smelled like floor cleaner and burnt coffee. Parents in nice coats stood near a folding table, signing in. A district woman with tired eyes sorted printed tags by last name. Somewhere to the left, a child was whining about being hungry even though it was not yet 5 o'clock. Jane smiled a little. This world was messier than the one she used to live in. That was one reason she trusted it more. You made it. She turned and saw Tessa by the auditorium doors, holding 2 paper cups and wearing the look of a woman who had already judged everybody in the parking lot. Tessa had been Jane's college roommate once. Now she was the director of a legal aid clinic downtown, the owner of 3 blazers that all looked expensive and weren't, and the friend who had shown up 6 years ago with soup, legal pads, and enough anger for both of them. I brought coffee, Tessa said. I'm not promising it's good. Jane took the cup. If it's hot, I respect it. Tessa gave her a once-over. You look incredible. Jane glanced down at herself. Cream blouse, navy pants, low heels, gold watch, simple makeup, hair smooth and pinned back at the sides. I was going for capable. You landed on expensive piece. Jane laughed. That sounds fake. No, fake piece is beige cashmere and dead eyes. You look like a woman who pays her own bills and sleeps at night. Jane took a sip of the coffee and made a face. This is terrible. I know. For a second they just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, the way old friends do when the support has already been said too many times to need repeating. Then Tessa tilted her head toward the door. He's inside. Of course he was. Nolan Mercer was always early when the room mattered. Jane stepped closer to the narrow glass panel and looked in. There he was near the front, talking to the board chair and two men from the school development committee. One hand in his pocket, the other making those small neat gestures that said, "I know exactly how this room works." His hair had more gray now. Suited him. So did the dark suit and the polished shoes and the face of a man who had spent his whole life being listened to. He turned slightly, reacting to something one of the men said, and Jane felt that old jolt she hated. Not love. Not grief. Just memory. Tessa followed her gaze. There's the man who once told a judge you were too emotional to handle school pickup. Jane kept looking through the glass. Please don't get us thrown out. I will behave. You say that like a woman with no history. Tessa put a hand over her heart. I am deeply wounded by your accuracy. Jane smiled, but it faded fast. Because Nolan looked up. Even through the glass, she saw the second it hit him. He didn't do anything dramatic. He didn't stare. He didn't go stiff. That would have been too easy to read. He just set the folder in his hand down on a chair beside him and forgot to pick it back up. Jane noticed because she knew him. Nolan only put things down when his mind had left the room. Tessa leaned in. That's right, sir. Be confused. Please, Jane muttered. No. I waited years for this. Jane straightened her shoulders, took one more sip of terrible coffee, then handed the cup back to Tessa. If I throw up, tell people it was the coffee. If you throw up, I'm billing Hawthorne. Jane pushed open the auditorium door. The room was bright in that school building way that makes everybody look a little more tired than they are. Stacked chairs, printed agendas, a stage with dark curtains that had probably seen every school concert since 1998. Parents sat in rows, tapping phones and whispering to each other. A few heads turned, then a few more. Nobody made a scene. Nobody had to. Attention moved through the room like weather. Quiet but real. Jane walked down the aisle beside Tessa with her face calm and her steps even. Not because she felt calm. Because she had learned a long time ago that sometimes confidence is just choosing not to rush. Nolan stepped away from the front row before she reached her seat. Jane. His voice was low. Careful. Nolan. Up close, he looked almost exactly like memory had saved him. Clean shave. Sharp collar. Controlled face. But there was something else there too. He had expected to see a woman still piecing herself together. What stood in front of him was a woman who had already finished. You look. He paused. Jane nearly smiled. He probably had 3 words ready and none of them fit anymore. Prepared, she said. Tessa made a choking sound that might have been a laugh. Nolan looked at Jane for another second, then gave a short breath through his nose. I was going to say confident. That works too. A woman in pearls 3 rows ahead pretended not to be listening and failed badly. Jane knew her. Back when Jane was still Mrs. Mercer, that woman had hosted holiday lunches with catered salads and ice cubes shaped like flowers. She used to speak to Jane like Jane was a smart lamp Nolan had chosen well. Now the woman's face said she was trying to catch up. Good, Jane thought. Let her. Nolan glanced at Tessa. I didn't know you were involved in this. Tessa smiled. I'm not. I'm here for moral support and because I heard there'd be free cookies. There are no cookies, Jane said. That's a weak institution. Nolan looked back at Jane. Can we talk after? She met his eyes. If there's something to say, you can say it here. A beat passed between them. Then he gave one small nod like a man filing something away. All right. Jane moved past him and took her seat. Tessa sat beside her and whispered, Oh, this is already worth missing dinner. Jane kept her eyes on the front of the room. Please act like a person. I am acting like a person, just not a forgiving one. The meeting was called to order by Dr. Alvarez, the board chair, a woman in her 60s with silver hair, square glasses, and the patient face of someone who had spent a lifetime hearing men speak too long. She welcomed everyone, thanked the parent committee, apologized for the microphone issue before anybody complained, and started the agenda. Jane listened, but only partly. The other part of her mind had already slipped backward. Back before the suitcase. Before the custody meetings. Before Nolan started speaking for both of them so often that people forgot she had her own voice. They met at a museum fundraiser in the city. Jane had gone because a friend from work had an extra ticket and promised free wine and better snacks than either of them could afford. Jane almost skipped it because she had a headache and no interest in wealthy men explaining paintings they did not understand. Then Nolan Mercer walked up beside her in front of a huge abstract canvas and said, "I think this artist is trying very hard to seem mysterious." Jane had looked at him and said, "That's because you're standing too close. Back up 6 feet and it starts making sense." He did. Then he laughed. "Okay," he said. "I deserved that." That was how it started. Simple. A smart man who listened. A warm man who asked questions. A man who seemed amused by himself, which was rare and attractive. He loved that Jane worked in educational publishing. Loved that she cared about reading rates, classroom access, and whether kids saw themselves in books. He used to say her work reminded him that the world was bigger than money. "You make me think better," he told her once across a dinner table lit by candles too small to be useful. Jane had believed him. In the beginning, Nolan made Jane feel seen. That was part of why it took so long to understand what was happening later. He listened when she talked. Not the fake kind of listening where a person just waits for their turn. Real listening. He remembered things. The names of her coworkers. The title of the first reading program she ever helped build. The fact that she hated blueberries but loved blueberry muffins because, in her words, sugar can fix almost anything for a few minutes. He made space for her opinions in public. At dinner parties, he would turn to her and say, "Jane, tell them what you said in the car about that." In those early years, it felt like respect. Felt like partnership. And when Nolan loved you, he loved you with full force. Flowers for no reason. Weekend trips. A beautiful apartment with wide windows and a kitchen Jane never would have picked for herself but slowly learned to cook in anyway. He talked about the future like it was already built. "We'll have a family. We'll make a real home. You'll never have to worry again." Jane used to hear that last line as comfort. She heard it very differently later. Back then, she was working long days in educational publishing, then taking freelance jobs at night to help literacy programs in underfunded schools. The money wasn't amazing, but the work mattered. She believed in it. She cared about children being treated like people, not numbers. Nolan admired that about her. First, he would smile when she got fired up about reading scores or broken school systems. "I love this look on your face," he told her once. "It's like you're arguing with the whole country." "Maybe I am." "Good. The country probably deserves it." Jane laughed and leaned into him. That was the thing about Nolan. He could be warm, funny, even. He knew how to make a woman feel chosen. And chosen feels dangerously close to safe when you're in love. Their wedding was beautiful in the way expensive things usually are. Soft lights, live music, white flowers everywhere. Jane's mother cried before the ceremony even started. Tessa spent half the reception stealing mini desserts off empty trays and muttering that if marriage failed, at least the catering had been worth it. For a while, Jane was happy. Not pretending. Actually happy. Their son was born 2 years later, and for a short time, Nolan softened in ways that made Jane think parenthood had changed him for the better. He held Eli like something fragile and priceless. He learned how to warm bottles. He walked the floor at night when the baby wouldn't sleep. He kissed Jane's forehead when she was too tired to make full sentences. That version of him had existed. Jane knew that because she had lived beside it. That made everything after harder to explain. Because people always want one clean villain. Real life rarely gives you one. The first changes were easy to miss. Nolan started making little comments about Jane's side work. "You're doing too much. You don't need to run yourself into the ground over every cause. We're fine, Jane. You don't have to keep proving something." He said those things gently, almost lovingly, and if she pushed back, he'd put a hand on her back or kiss her temple like he was calming a storm. "I'm trying to take care of you." That was how it always sounded. Care, concern, logic, never control. Then came the social edits. If Jane told a story at dinner, Nolan would jump in halfway through and clean it up. If she gave an opinion at a school event, he'd restate it 2 minutes later in a sharper tone, and somehow people would nod more at him. If she disagreed with him in front of others, he didn't fight. He'd just smile a little and say, "Jane sees the heart in things. I usually end up handling the practical side." People laughed. Jane laughed too sometimes. That was how it worked. You laugh the first few times because it feels too small to challenge. By the 10th or 15th time, the room has learned the roles. He's clear-headed. She's emotional. He leads. She feels. That script gets built slowly, and once it's built, other people start reading from it without even knowing. One night, after a school fundraiser, Jane took off her earrings in front of the bathroom mirror and said, "I didn't like the way you talked over me tonight." Nolan was loosening his tie in the bedroom doorway. "I didn't talk over you. You did." He shrugged. "You were rambling." Jane turned around. "I was answering a question. And I helped." That word again. Helped. Jane set her earrings down carefully because she could already feel her temper rising. "I don't need help finishing my own sentences." Nolan looked at her for a moment, then gave that small disappointed sigh he used when he wanted her to feel childish. "This is what I mean, Jane. Everything turns into a problem lately." "No. Everything turns into your version of the truth." He stared at her. Then he smiled a little. Not kindly. "You know what your issue is." Jane crossed her arms. "Please tell me. You're so used to being the smartest person in a room where nobody has any power that you don't know how to act when the stakes are real." The bathroom went very quiet. Jane just looked at him. He had never said it that plainly before. The thing underneath the comments, under the corrections, under the smooth concern, contempt. Nolan must have seen something change in her face, because his tone shifted right away. "I didn't mean that the way it sounded." "Yes," Jane said. "You did." He stepped forward. "You're twisting this." "No. I'm hearing you." He reached for her arm. She stepped back. That bothered him more than the argument. "Jane." "What?" "I am trying to build a life for this family. And I'm part of this family." "Of course you are." "That's not what I said." Nolan dragged a hand over his face. "You know what? I'm exhausted." That was another tactic. End the argument before she got to the center of it. Make her feel unreasonable for wanting to finish the conversation. He walked away. Jane stood in the bathroom alone, staring at herself in the mirror, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself say a thought all the way through. "This is not normal." After that, the pattern got clearer. If Jane wanted Eli in a teacher's class because the woman was warm and patient, Nolan wanted the stricter one because the world does not reward sensitivity. If Jane said Eli was anxious, Nolan said he was fine and just needed tougher standards. If Jane said a school event felt too performative, Nolan said that was because she always had a problem with systems that worked. She started noticing how often Nolan framed her instincts as weaknesses. How often he used words like practical, stable, reasonable, disciplined when talking about himself. And words like intense, reactive, idealistic, difficult when talking about her. Never in cruel ways. Always in ways that sounded almost thoughtful. That was what made it dangerous. Tessa saw it before Jane wanted to. One Sunday afternoon, Tessa came over with takeout and found Jane in the kitchen trying to finish grant notes, while also helping Eli glue together a solar system model for school. Nolan had canceled on them at the last minute for a donor dinner. Again, Tessa watched Jane move around the kitchen with that tired speed mothers get when they're trying to hold 5 things together with one brain. Then she said, "Can I say something and have you not get mad at me?" "That depends. Your husband talks to you like a manager fixing an employee." Jane kept writing for a second. "That's not fair." "See," Tessa said. "That is exactly why I asked first." Jane put the pen down. "He's under pressure. So are you. It's not the same." "Why? Because his pressure comes with better shoes." Jane laughed despite herself, then shook her head. "He's not a bad man, Tess. I didn't say he was." "Then what are you saying?" Tessa leaned back in the chair and looked toward the living room, where Eli was making orbit noises over his half-finished planets. I'm saying some men don't yell. They just keep adjusting the air in the room until you forget you were breathing fine before them. Jane went still. Who told you that? My Aunt Denise. Right before her third divorce. That got another laugh out of Jane. But the words stayed. They stayed because they were true. Still, truth is one thing. Acting on it is another. Jane kept trying. She suggested counseling. Nolan said they did not need to drag strangers into private matters. She asked for more say in school decisions. Nolan said she had plenty of say, but someone had to make final calls. She started a weekend reading project at the public library. Nolan asked why she was spending time on something so small. Because it matters. Does it? Jane looked up from Eli's lunchbox. Yes. Nolan leaned against the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone. Or does it make you feel useful? She shut the lunchbox a little harder than necessary. What does that even mean? It means you keep choosing things that let you play rescuer instead of thinking bigger. Jane stared at him. I work with children. You work around them. There's a difference. She felt herself go cold all over. I know exactly what I do. I'm not saying you don't care. Then say what you are saying. He looked up from the phone at last. I'm saying your energy would be better spent on your own family than on every broken system that makes you feel noble. There it was again. He could make service sound selfish. He could make conscience sound like vanity. And if you lived inside that long enough, you started checking your own motives before you even opened your mouth. That was one of the worst parts. Not just that he cut her down, that he taught her to help. By the time Eli was 8, Jane had become careful in ways she barely recognized. Careful about tone. Careful about timing. Careful about disagreeing in public. Careful about sounding too upset, too sharp, too much. She would rehearse simple conversations in her head before bringing them to Nolan because she knew he could slide out of almost any direct challenge if he had enough time and the right room. Then came Hawthorne Academy. That school became the center of everything. On paper, it was perfect. Strong academics, beautiful campus, big donor network, families with money and plans and polished children who already knew how to shake hands like future senators. Nolan loved it instantly. Jane liked parts of it. Not all. She thought the place cared too much about image and not enough about softness. Too much about building stars and not enough about making sure children slept at night. When Eli started there, he adjusted on the outside faster than on the inside. He got good grades. Teachers liked him. He smiled when people looked. But Jane saw the rest. The stomach aches before presentations. The silence after long school days. The way he would sit in the back seat and stare out the window instead of talking. One night, while Nolan was at a dinner, Jane found Eli awake long past bedtime, sitting on the floor of his room with a workbook open and tears running down his face. She sat beside him. What happened? He wiped his nose with the back of his hand. I got one thing wrong. Jane looked at the page. One math problem. One. Baby. That's it? Eli's mouth shook. Dad said details matter. Jane closed the workbook. No. Listen to me. Details matter. But one wrong answer does not mean there is something wrong with you. He looked at her like he wanted to believe that and wasn't sure he was allowed. That look stayed with her. The next morning she brought it up with Nolan over coffee. He's putting too much pressure on himself. Nolan kept reading his phone. He's learning standards. He's 8. He's gifted. He's tired. Nolan set the phone down then, annoyed now that she had not taken the hint. Jane, the world is not going to get softer because you want it to, and he doesn't need it to be soft. He needs it to be sane. Nolan gave a dry laugh. You always do this. Do what? You take one hard moment and turn it into some big emotional theory. Jane leaned both hands on the counter. He was crying on the floor. He was frustrated. He was scared. He was fine. Jane looked at him across the kitchen, really looked at him, and understood something she had been resisting for years. Nolan did not just have different instincts than she did. He trusted hers less because they were hers. That was different. That was worse. The school issue kept growing from there. By the time Eli was 9, Hawthorne was choosing students for a highly selective academic track. Nolan wanted Eli in it. Jane did not. She had met the director twice. Once at a parent event and once during a classroom open house. Both times, the woman had spoken about children like they were products with future market value. Jane had gone home uneasy. Nolan had gone home impressed. A week before the blow-up, Jane said, "I don't think this program is right for him." Nolan folded his napkin and looked at her. "Of course it is." "No." He smiled a little. "You haven't even read all the materials. I've met the woman running it. And I've spoken with 3 board members, 2 department leads, and the headmaster." Jane stared at him. "That isn't the point." "It's exactly the point." "No. The point is he's a child, not a campaign." Nolan sat back in his chair. "Do you hear yourself?" "Yes. Because you sound threatened by a challenge." Jane almost laughed. "I'm not threatened by a challenge. I'm worried about our son." "You're worried because this kind of place makes you uncomfortable." That landed hard. "Excuse me. You don't trust institutions unless they talk like you, feel like you, bend around every emotion in the room." Jane pushed back from the table. "You know what? We're done for tonight. Because you can't defend your point. Because I'm tired of having to." Nolan stood too. "Jane." "No." He stepped closer. "This is exactly why I handle these things." She stared at him. "You handle them because you don't believe anyone else should." And that was the week everything broke open. 2 days later, Jane heard that phone call through the half-closed office door. Nolan was already making moves at the school. Already speaking as if the decision was his. Already using relationships, influence, pressure. When he came out and found her standing in the hall, neither of them pretended. "You went around me. I moved things forward." "For who?" "For Eli." "No. For you." He looked at her like a person choosing how much of the truth to admit. Then he said, "Sometimes leadership means making decisions other people are too emotional to make." Jane's whole body went still, because there it was. No soft packaging. No careful concern. Just the thing itself. Too emotional. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "You really think I'm the problem in this house?" Nolan did not answer. He didn't need to. By that night, she was walking down the driveway with one suitcase. Back in the school auditorium, Dr. Alvarez was still working through the agenda, but Jane barely heard any of it. She had been sitting in the same chair for maybe 15 minutes and already felt like she had lived 6 years in reverse. Tessa touched her sleeve lightly. "You still with me?" Jane blinked and nodded. "Yeah." "You left for a second." "I know." Tessa studied her face. "You want to bail? I'll pull the fire alarm." Jane snorted. "You would not." "Correct. Too traceable. But I'd fake a coughing fit so violent they'd have to clear the room." Jane looked toward the front again. Nolan had his reading glasses on now. He was scanning paperwork, calm as ever. Like the past was a filing cabinet he had already closed. For the first time that evening, Jane felt something sharper than nerves. Not fear. Annoyance. No, more than that. Clarity. She had spent years surviving what he did. He had spent years assuming survival looked messier than this. Good. Let him learn in public. At that moment, Dr. Alvarez looked up from her notes. "Ms. Ellison." Jane straightened. "We moved comments a little earlier than planned. You'll be up in about 10 minutes. Jane gave a small nod. "Thank you." As she reached for her folder, movement at the side door caught her eye. Eli slipped into the room and took a place near the back wall. 15 years old now. Tall. Long limbs. School blazer half open. Tie already loose in that way boys do the second they're out of class. He looked older than he should have and younger than he wanted to. He saw her looking and gave one small nod. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. That nod did more for her than the coffee ever could. Nolan noticed him too. He half turned, almost like he might wave him over. Then he stopped, because even from across the room, something about Eli's face said not now. Jane picked up her folder and stood. Her name would be called soon. And this time, when she walked to the front of the room, she would not be speaking as Nolan Mercer's wife. She would be speaking as Jane Ellison, a woman he once sent out with one suitcase. A woman who had come back with something better than revenge. Proof. When Dr. Alvarez called her name, Jane stood up slowly. Not for effect. Because she had learned that moving too fast was how nerves got control of your body. She picked up her folder, smoothed the front of her blouse once, and walked toward the podium while the room settled into that polite kind of quiet people use when they are not sure yet whether something matters. The microphone gave one sharp squeal when she touched it. A few people flinched. Someone near the middle muttered, "Every time." That helped, weirdly. It made the room feel human again. Jane adjusted the stand herself and looked out at the rows of parents, staff, board members, and school people who had all learned to look interested in very different ways. "My name is Jane Ellison," she said, "and I'm the founder of Bright Pages." No grand voice, no trying to sound impressive, just steady. We started small, really small. 12 kids, 2 folding tables, 1 basement room in a church that smelled like old crayons and heat pipes. Most of the kids who came to us were already smart, already funny, already full of ideas. The problem was, a lot of them had already decided school wasn't built for kids like them. A few people looked up from their notes. Good. Jane kept going. She talked about reading not as a test score but as a door. She talked about what happened when children were corrected all day and almost never invited to create anything. She talked about what it meant when a child stopped raising a hand, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had learned it felt safer not to need anything in public. She knew her numbers, her retention rates, her attendance gains, her volunteer structure. She had all of that in the folder. But she also knew this room needed more than numbers. So she gave them both. We've worked with students who were called distracted when they were really overwhelmed. We've worked with kids who were labeled lazy when they were embarrassed. We've worked with children who got so used to feeling behind that they stopped trying before class even started. Bright Pages gives them room to build confidence before somebody decides who they are. Dr. Alvarez was watching closely now. 2 teachers in the back row had stopped whispering. One of the parents from the advisory panel had lowered her phone. Jane felt the room leaning in, just a little. So she let herself go one step deeper. I care about literacy. I care about writing. I care about giving children tools they can use for the rest of their lives. But I also care about something else. I care about what happens to a child when every adult around them is measuring performance and nobody is asking what the pressure is doing. That landed harder. Because every room with school people in it is also a room full of adults pretending they are only discussing policy when they are really discussing children. Jane let the silence stay for a beat. Not long. Just long enough. Then she turned one page in her folder and said, "We like to say kids are resilient. And some are. But sometimes what looks like adjustment is really a child learning not to need anything out loud." This time she looked directly at Nolan. She didn't swing her head dramatically. She didn't point. She didn't sharpen her tone. She just looked at him. And because she kept her voice calm, the line landed even cleaner. No one in the room reacted in any big way. That was not how truth worked in places like this. It didn't explode. It sat down in the middle of the room and made everybody shift in their chairs. Jane saw Nolan's hand move almost on its own. His thumb pressed once against the side of his ring finger, the old tell he still had whenever he was irritated and trying not to show it. She looked away first, not because she had lost anything, because she didn't need to hold the stare. She moved into the final part of her talk. She explained how Bright Pages trained volunteers, how student progress was tracked, how families were updated, how school staff were looped in, how the pilot expansion would work if the district approved the proposal. No fluff, no extra speeches, just work. When she finished, she thanked the board, stepped back from the microphone, and waited. The first round of applause was light. Then it grew warmer, not loud, not dramatic, but real. Jane exhaled once through her nose and returned to her seat. The woman in pearls from earlier was looking at her now with a totally different face. Not warmth. Not friendship. Respect mixed with the annoyance some people feel when they realize they judged somebody too early and now have to act right. Tessa leaned in as Jane sat down. You were so good just now I briefly became a worse person. Jane kept her eyes front. How? I started resenting everybody else for not being you. That's not healthy. I didn't say it was. Jane bit back a smile. At the board table, Dr. Alvarez lifted her glasses and looked down at her notes. Thank you, Ms. Ellison. That was clear and helpful. She glanced toward the other members. Questions. A man near the end of the table, a district finance officer with a red tie and tired forehead lines, spoke first. What would you say is your biggest challenge in scaling this? Space, Jane said. Not structure. We have staff systems, training systems, family reporting systems. The need is bigger than the rooms we're working with. Another member asked about volunteer screening. Jane answered that too. Then a principal from one of the middle schools asked whether Bright Pages had seen stronger outcomes with early readers or older students who already had negative feelings about school. Jane said, both, but the older students can surprise you more. When a child has decided they're bad at learning, helping them change that story matters just as much as helping them read better. There were a few nods around the room. Jane felt it then. Not victory. Momentum. It had been years since she sat in rooms like this and let herself trust what she knew. That felt good. Then Nolan stood up. Of course he did. He buttoned his jacket first, which was such a Nolan thing to do. Jane nearly laughed. Everything with him came with a layer of preparation. Even interruption. My son has benefited from enrichment opportunities in both public and private settings. He began, voice smooth, measured, agreeable. So I want to be clear that I'm not opposed to arts and literacy support. There it was already, that careful setup. The sentence before the sentence. Jane sat very still. My concern, he went on, is oversight. Passion is important. But when we're discussing district-level partnerships, the standard can't just be heart. It has to be structure, accountability, leadership. Programs like this can sound strong in a presentation and still fall apart under expansion if the organization behind them isn't ready. A couple of people shifted. If you didn't know him, it sounded fair, even thoughtful. If you did know him, you heard the knife under the table. Passion, heart, sound strong, not ready. It was the same old move. Dress doubt up as professionalism. Make a woman sound inspiring right before you suggest she may not be qualified. Dr. Alvarez looked at him over her glasses. Do you have a question, Mr. Mercer? Nolan turned just enough to include both the board and the room. Yes, I'd like more clarity on whether Ms. Ellison's organization has the infrastructure to support expansion at this level without compromising consistency. There was a beat. Jane felt Tessa go still beside her. She also felt something else. Not panic. Not anger. Recognition. He had brought the same trick into a different room. He really thought it still worked. Jane picked up her pen, set it down again, and stood. Yes, she said. We do. Nolan turned toward her, polite face still in place. Jane walked halfway back toward the front, not all the way to the podium this time. She didn't need the microphone. Our systems are built for growth, she said. We have staff development, family reporting, grant compliance, student progress measures, and outside advisors. What we need is room, not permission to be taken seriously. That last line made one of the board members glance up fast. Nolan kept his expression smooth, but his eyes changed. There it was. A little surprise, a little annoyance, a little not this version of her. He said, No one is questioning whether your work matters. Jane nodded once. That's true. You're questioning whether I can lead it. Dr. Alvarez sat back in her chair. The room had gotten much quieter now. Nolan gave one of those tiny smiles that wasn't really a smile. I'm asking the same question any responsible person should ask. Jane held his gaze. No, Nolan. You're asking a very familiar question in a very familiar tone. Tessa let out a soft breath beside her like a person trying not to applaud too early. Nolan's face stayed composed, but his jaw tightened just enough for Jane to catch it. That should have been the big moment. That should have been the turning point. It wasn't, because someone in the back of the room said, "She can." Every head turned. Eli was standing by the wall with one hand still hooked through the strap of his backpack. Jane's whole body went still. Nolan turned slower. Dr. Alvarez blinked. Eli. He looked young and old at the same time. That awkward in-between age where a boy's voice is trying to settle and his body hasn't finished catching up. But his face was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm children get when they've thought about something for a long time before finally speaking. "My mother can," he said. Then he stopped, glanced at the room, and corrected himself. "Ms. Ellison can." A few people smiled despite themselves. Eli kept going. "I interned with Bright Pages last summer. She has systems for everything. Staff notes, family updates, reading goals, attendance checks. She knows which kids need extra support and which kids act like they don't care because they're embarrassed." Jane's eyes burned all at once. She did not move. Nobody moved. Nolan said quietly, "Eli." It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry, but it had that father tone in it. The one that meant enough now. Eli looked at him and kept standing. That did something to the room, because there are moments when a child not sitting down says more than any speech could. "She also remembers people," Eli said. "Not just numbers. Not just reports. She remembers names. She remembers who hates reading out loud. She remembers who needs 5 extra minutes before getting in the car after a bad day. She remembers stuff other people miss." There was another silence. This one longer. Jane stared at her folded hands for 1 second because if she looked straight at him right then, she might not hold herself together in a way she wanted strangers to witness. Dr. Alvarez cleared her throat. "Well, student perspective is valuable, even when it arrives off schedule." A soft laugh moved through the room. "Human, not mean." Eli sat back down. Nolan did not move for half a second, then returned to his seat with the slow care of a man trying to recover a room without making the recovery obvious. Tessa leaned toward Jane and whispered, "That child just threw a chair without using his hands." Jane almost laughed and cried at the same time. Instead, she pressed her lips together and looked at the board table. One of the members, a woman with a yellow scarf and a stack of color-coded tabs in her binder, said, "I'd actually like to hear more about the staff support model." Just like that, the meeting moved on. But the air had changed. That was the thing about certain moments. They did not always look huge from the outside. Sometimes all that happened was one honest sentence from the right person at the right time. And after that, nothing fit back into the old shape. Jane answered more questions. This time the questions had a different feel to them. Less suspicion. More curiosity. One board member wanted to know if Bright Pages could support pilot programs in 2 schools instead of 1. Another asked if the waiting list data could be included in the district packet. By the time the discussion moved to the next agenda item, 3 different people had written down her contact information. Not because Nolan approved, because they had listened. Jane sat back in her chair and finally let herself look toward the back of the room. Eli was leaning against the wall again now, face neutral, as if he had not just changed the entire evening. He caught her eye, gave the smallest shrug, like what it was true. Jane looked away fast and swallowed hard. Tessa leaned close. "You made that kid." Jane whispered back, "I know. And for the record, he's my favorite Mercer." Jane laughed under her breath. "He's not a Mercer to me right now. No. Right now he's a federal witness." The meeting crawled through 2 more agenda items after that. School security updates, transportation complaints, a proposal about field trip budgeting that made half the room look like they regretted being alive. Jane used the time to breathe. She rolled her shoulders once, took a sip of lukewarm water, opened her folder, then closed it again. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. Across the room, Nolan stayed outwardly calm. He spoke once to the man beside him, took notes, nodded at a budget line, did all the things a man does when he wants the room to believe nothing important has happened to him. But Jane knew better. Every now and then his eyes went to Eli, then to her, then away. Good, she thought. Let him sit in it. At last Dr. Alvarez closed the meeting. Thank you, everyone. We'll follow up with next steps by the end of the week. Chairs scraped. Papers shuffled. Conversations started up fast, the way they always do after people have been politely trapped in one place too long. Jane was still gathering her things when the first person came over. It was the principal from West Side Middle, a short woman with a green coat and sensible shoes. Ms. Ellison, she said, I've heard about Bright Pages for 2 years. I'd like your card if you're open to a conversation. Jane smiled and handed one over. Absolutely. Then a district consultant stepped in. I'd love a copy of your data packet. Of course. Then the woman in pearls appeared, smiling too quickly. Jane, it's been forever. Jane looked at her. It had not been forever. It had been 3 months since they passed each other at a school fundraiser and the woman pretended not to see her. Still, Jane smiled. It has been a while. You spoke beautifully tonight. Thank you. The woman nodded, eyes flicking briefly toward the front of the room where Nolan was speaking to someone from the donor committee. I had no idea your program had grown so much. Jane slipped her folder under one arm. A lot can happen when people stop underestimating you. The woman blinked. Then she laughed the wrong kind of laugh. Thin, surprised. Well, yes, quite. Tessa appeared at Jane's side like she had smelled fake energy from across the room. Jane, I need to steal you in 1 minute, she said pleasantly. The woman in pearls took the hint and moved on. Tessa watched her leave. She wanted to borrow your shine and then return it wrinkled. Jane snorted. That sentence needs supervision. I stand by it. A man from the district finance office came over next and asked a serious question about cost per student. Jane answered it. Then a teacher from Hawthorne asked if Bright Pages offered parent workshops. Then one of the board members told her she appreciated the way Jane talked about pressure and silence in children. Each conversation was small, but together they built something. Proof stacked in real time. And through all of it, Jane could feel Nolan at the edge of the room, waiting. He always preferred to speak once the audience had thinned. That way he could still act as if the conversation belonged to him. Jane zipped her folder and turned just as his shadow crossed the edge of the table. Can we talk? Not a question. Not really. Tessa looked up immediately. Jane met Nolan's eyes. Here is fine. He glanced around the room, measured the distance to the nearest people, then gave one short nod. All right. Tessa folded her arms. Great. I love an open floor plan. Nolan ignored her. That, more than anything, told Jane this mattered. Because normally he would have found a polished way to cut her out of the exchange. Tonight he was too focused. Eli was across the room now with 2 student council kids, saying something near the exit and pretending not to check on them. Close enough to see, far enough not to hear every word. Nolan slipped one hand into his pocket and looked at Jane. You've done well. Jane held his gaze. Thank you. I mean it. She believed that part. That was the strange thing. After all these years, she could still tell when he was lying for strategy and when he was telling the truth badly. He looked around the room once. The folding chairs, the school seal on the wall, the half-empty coffee station, the papers left behind on seats. Then back at her. I didn't expect this. Jane's face stayed calm. No, you didn't. And that was where the real conversation began. Nolan stood there with one hand in his pocket, the same way he used to stand in doorways when he thought he still had the final word. But this room was different. Jane was different. And whatever old rhythm he expected between them, it did not show up. He looked at her for a moment and said again, quieter this time, I mean it. Jane adjusted the folder under her arm. I heard you. A parent brushed past them carrying a stack of printed handouts. Somebody near the exit was arguing softly about whether the parking lot meter still applied after 6. The room was thinning, but not empty. Good. Jane wanted witnesses if not listeners. Nolan glanced toward Eli, then back at her. You handled yourself well tonight. Jane almost laughed. Handled myself. He let out a breath. You know what I mean. Yes, she said. I do. His mouth shifted a little. Not anger. More like the discomfort of hearing his own old language come back without the shine on it. Tessa stayed close, sorting through papers that did not need sorting. Jane knew exactly what she was doing. Guard duty. Nolan looked at Tessa briefly, then at Jane again. I'm not here to argue. No, Jane said. You're here because things didn't go how you thought they would. That landed. He did not deny it. For a second he looked older than he had from across the room. Not weaker, just older. I didn't know, he said. Jane waited. That your program had grown like this. That Eli was involved. That you were... He stopped. Say it. He looked right at her then. Doing this well. There it was. Not an apology. Not admiration exactly. Something stranger. A man admitting that the future he predicted for her had failed to arrive. Jane nodded once. I worked for it. I can see that. She almost said, you could have seen it years ago if you ever bothered to look at me without measuring what I was worth to you. Instead she said, could you? Nolan's jaw tightened. Tessa looked between them like she had just sat down in the front row of a play she already hated the lead actor in. Nolan lowered his voice. Jane. No. You wanted to talk. So talk. He glanced toward the back again where Eli was still near the door with the student council kids. Then he looked around the room, maybe checking how much privacy he had, maybe realizing for once that privacy was not a thing he got to demand from her anymore. You've built something solid, he said. I can admit that. Jane held his gaze. You say that like it should mean more than it does. His face changed just a little. What do you want from me? That question almost made her smile. Not because it was funny, because it was so typical. As if every hard conversation had to end in a request. As if pain was only real if it had an action item attached. What do I want? Yes. Jane shifted her coat onto one arm and thought for a second. There were years packed into that silence. The suitcase, the custody filings, the judges and lawyers and careful language. The way he delayed support payments just enough to make her panic but not enough to get caught doing it on purpose. The school parents who stopped calling her after the divorce because Nolan got to the room first and told the cleaner story. The nights she sat at Tessa's kitchen table with a calculator, trying to stretch 1 month into another while Eli slept in borrowed sheets down the hall. What did she want? The truth was, years ago she had wanted a lot. She wanted him to understand what he had done. She wanted him to feel every bit of fear he handed her. She wanted one clean, massive apology big enough to match the damage. But life had moved, and something else had taken its place. You told me I'd be lost without you, she said. Nolan went very still. I remember. Jane looked at him for a long second. I don't think you do. His eyes stayed on hers. You said it while our son was upstairs. A shadow moved across his face then. Small but real. Jane kept going. You stood in that doorway and acted like you were being reasonable. Like I was too emotional to be trusted. Like leaving me out there with one suitcase was some kind of mature decision instead of what it really was. Tessa stopped shuffling papers. Across the room, a chair scraped the floor. Somebody laughed too loudly at something by the exit, then quieted when they caught the tone over here. Nolan's voice was lower when he spoke. I was angry. Jane's eyes did not leave his. That's a description, not an explanation. He looked down for half a second, then back at her. You're right. She waited. Maybe once, years ago, she would have jumped in to help him with the sentence. Given him space. Softened the edge. Turned his half-truth into something easier for them both. Not tonight. Nolan took a breath. I was angry, he said again, but differently this time. And I wanted control of the situation. Jane felt a cold little spark move through her chest. There. Finally. Something honest. He kept going, slower now, like a man stepping across ground he had avoided for years. You challenged me. About Eli. About the school. About. He glanced away. About a lot of things. And I told myself you were making everything harder. That I was the one keeping the house from coming apart. That if I gave in on one thing, I'd lose control of all of it. Jane let him finish. Then she said, So you put me out. His face tightened. Yes. The words stayed in the air between them. Small. Flat. Awful. Tessa looked like she might throw a stapler at him. Jane did not move. It wasn't just that, she said. And you know it. Nolan said nothing. You didn't just put me out. You made sure people heard your version first. You told the court I was unstable. You told school people I was overwhelmed. You acted like I was some fragile mess who could barely hold a schedule together. His mouth opened, then closed. Jane took one step closer. And the wild part is, Nolan, I almost believed you. That hit harder than the rest. Because it was not polished. It was true. He looked at her like he had not expected that part. I know, he said. For a second Jane just stared at him. Then she gave one short, humorless laugh. You know. His voice dropped. I knew I had influence. I knew how people heard me. I knew what I was doing in those rooms. He paused. At least some of it. At least some of it, Jane repeated. I'm not asking you to excuse it. Good. I'm saying I see it now. Jane's expression did not change. That's nice for you. Tessa made a quiet sound that might have been a cough and might have been approval. Nolan looked tired then. Not tired like a man after a long meeting. Tired like a man hearing himself without the usual filter. I was hard on you, he said. Jane folded her arms. You were more than hard. He nodded once. Yes. No long speech. No dramatic collapse. No movie scene where the guilty man suddenly becomes eloquent. Just a wealthy man in a school auditorium, finally speaking in blunt enough words that even he could hear how ugly they sounded. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was not nothing either. Across the room, Eli laughed at something one of the student council boys said. The sound cut through everything. Both Jane and Nolan turned toward it without meaning to. Nolan watched his son for a second, then said quietly, He's different with you. Jane looked back at him. With me. He defends you. There was something in the way he said it that almost sounded puzzled. Maybe hurt, like he was trying to understand why trust had settled so firmly on her side of the line. Jane's voice stayed calm. He doesn't defend me because I asked him to. I know. He defends me because he has eyes. That one landed too. Nolan did not push back. Instead he said, When did he start working with your program? Last summer. You never mentioned it. Jane blinked at him. You weren't asking about my work. His eyes narrowed slightly. That's not fair. No. What's unfair is acting shocked that our son knows a whole part of my life you never bothered to learn. Nolan looked away. Jane kept going. You asked about his test scores, his schedule, his applications, whether his debate coach was strong enough, whether his math placement was on track. She tilted her head. That's not the same as knowing him. A muscle moved in Nolan's cheek. That was always the spot where irritation showed first when he was trying to keep the rest of his face under control. I'm trying with him, he said. Jane believed that too. That was the complicated part. He was trying. He just had no idea how late trying could feel when somebody had already built a whole language of distance by mistake. I know you are, she said. He looked surprised by that, then wary. Maybe he thought kindness from her was the start of softness. It wasn't. It was just accuracy. Jane glanced toward Eli again. He notices things. More than either of us gave him credit for when he was little. Nolan let out one dry breath of a laugh. That's unfortunate. For you, maybe. This time he actually laughed. Briefly. It changed his face so fast it almost startled her. There had been years when that sound was part of her daily life. Years when she knew what kind of joke would get it, what look, what timing. For 1 second the old memory of that life passed between them like a shadow. Then it was gone. Nolan sobered first. You seem happy, he said. Jane thought about that. The answer was so simple now, which was funny considering how hard she used to search for it. Not glamorous. Not untouched. Not easy. But happy. In the apartment she had painted herself because the landlord said she could if she returned the walls to white later. In the kitchen where every mug matched nothing and every bill got paid because she paid it. In bright pages, where children walked in with their shoulders up by their ears and walked out arguing about poems. In the life she built slow enough to trust. In the version of herself that no longer flinched when a man spoke with money in his voice. "Yes," she said. "I am." Nolan looked at her for a long second. "It looks good on you." There were years when that sentence would have wrecked her. Not now. Now it just felt late. Not false. Late. Jane nodded once. "I know." That answer hit him too. He was used to praise being accepted as a gift, not as a fact the other person had already decided for themselves. For a moment neither of them spoke. The room around them kept emptying. Parents gathered bags. A janitor waited near the back wall with the calm patience of a man who had seen adults drag simple things out for far too long. Dr. Alvarez stood near the board table talking to two committee members. But Jane could feel that the older woman's eyes flicked their way once or twice. Nolan put both hands in his pockets now. That usually meant he was trying not to reach for control and not quite succeeding. "I've been thinking," he said. Tessa muttered, "God help us." Jane did not look at her. Nolan almost smiled despite himself, then looked at Jane again. "I've been thinking about some of the things Eli doesn't tell me." Jane said nothing. "He's respectful. He answers questions. He does what he's supposed to do." Nolan swallowed. "But there's distance." Jane kept her face still. He was not telling her anything she didn't know. She had watched Eli become careful around his father in the same slow way she once became careful around her husband. Different reasons. Same instinct. Nolan stared past her shoulder for a second and then said, "I don't think I understood how much he saw." Jane's voice softened, but not enough to save him from the truth. "He saw plenty." Nolan nodded like a man taking a hit he knew he had earned. "He remembers the house." Jane's throat tightened. "Yes. He asked me about it once." That caught her off guard. Jane's eyes sharpened. "When?" "A few months ago." "And?" Nolan looked at the floor for 1 second, then back up. "He asked why you only had one suitcase." Jane did not breathe. For all the years since that night, she had wondered how much of it Eli carried as memory and how much lived in him more quietly as feeling. Nolan answered before she asked. "I told him I handled it badly." Jane stared at him. "That's what you said." "Yes." A bitter little smile touched her mouth. Again with badly. He took that without defending himself. "Maybe I'm still behind the truth," he said. That was the closest thing to humility she had ever heard from him. And because life is rude, the fact that it was real made it harder, not easier. Jane drew in a breath and let it out slowly. "You are." He nodded. Then, for the first time since he walked up to her after the meeting, his voice lost that boardroom smoothness completely. "I can't undo it." "No. I know that." "Good." Another pause. Then Nolan said, "I don't expect forgiveness tonight." Jane tilted her head. "Tonight?" "I don't expect it at all," he corrected. That was better. Not by much, but better. Before Jane could answer, footsteps crossed the room toward them. Eli, backpack over one shoulder. Blazer wrinkled now, tie looser than before. Teenager face trying to look neutral and not quite managing it. "You ready?" he asked Jane. "Almost." His eyes moved between them fast, reading the air in that quiet, skilled way children of divorce learn far too young. "Everything okay?" Jane smiled at him. "Yes." Nolan rested a hand lightly on Eli's shoulder. "You spoke well." Eli shifted under the touch. Not pulling away exactly, not leaning in either. "I meant it." "I know." That exchange lasted maybe 3 seconds. But Jane felt all the missing years inside it. All the things that should have been built differently. All the trust that had been thinned, not by one giant betrayal alone, but by 1,000 smaller moments that taught a boy where he felt safest. Tessa slung her bag over her shoulder. "Well," she said, "this has been a beautiful evening in municipal tension, but I'm starving." Eli looked at Jane. "Can we get burgers?" Jane smiled. "That sounds perfect." Nolan looked at his son. "I can drop you home after dinner if you want." Eli answered right away. I'm going with Mom. It was not rude. That was what made it sting more. Just clear. Nolan's face stayed neutral, but the disappointment made a shadow of itself there anyway. That's fine, he said. I'll see you tomorrow. Eli nodded once. No hug. No extra words. Just agreement. Nolan looked at Jane then. There were still things he wanted to say. She could see that much. But for once, maybe he understood that wanting the last word and deserving it were not the same thing. In the end, he gave one short nod. Goodbye, Jane. Goodbye, Nolan. He stepped back. Not dramatically. Not defeated in any showy way. Just back. And sometimes that is what real change looks like. A person finally understanding where they no longer get to stand. Jane turned with Tessa and Eli and started toward the door. The cold hit them the second they stepped outside. Sharp air. Late light. The kind of evening where the sky looks bruised at the edges before it goes dark. Parents cross the parking lot in little groups, still talking about the meeting, sports schedules, pickup plans, bake sale forms, all the ordinary pieces of life that keep moving no matter what kind of private earthquake just happened inside a building. Jane pulled her coat tighter around herself. Tessa clicked the car open from halfway across the lot. Tell me there are fries wherever we're going, she said. There better be, Eli answered. They walked a few more steps. Then Eli slowed. Mom! Jane turned to him. Yeah. He looked down at the pavement first. At a crack in the asphalt. At one brown leaf stuck near the curb. Anywhere but right at her. Tessa, bless her, got the message and drifted a few feet ahead toward the car without making a thing of it. Eli kept one hand on the strap of his backpack. When he made you leave, he said quietly. I remember the suitcase. Jane stopped walking. Of course he remembered. Children remember the details adults pray will blur. The sound. The coat. The door. The fact of being too small to stop it. Jane's voice came out softer than she expected. I know. Eli nodded, still looking down. I used to think that was the saddest thing I ever saw. The parking lot carried on around them. Doors shutting. Engines starting. Somebody calling a child back from the curb. Far off, a leaf blower kicked up for no reason anybody could justify. Jane stood very still. Then Eli looked up. But I don't think that anymore. Her throat tightened. What do you think now? He gave one shoulder a little shrug, embarrassed already by how honest he was about to be. I think he thought that was the end of your story. He swallowed. And he was wrong. Jane could not speak for a second. Not because she did not know what to say. Because some truths arrive so clean, they stop you. Eli stood there in the cold evening light, taller than she remembered and still somehow the same little boy from the upstairs window. His face had changed. His voice had changed. His shoulders had widened. But in that moment, Jane could see both versions of him at once. The child who watched her leave, and the young man who now understood what that moment really meant. She reached for him. Eli let out a tiny sigh, like a teenager already embarrassed by his own honesty. But he stepped into her arms anyway. He hugged her back hard. Just for a second. Maybe two. Then he leaned away and rubbed the back of his neck. Okay, he muttered. That was a lot. Jane laughed, but it came out wet. Yes, she said. It was. Tessa called from the driver's side door. I'm giving you both 10 more seconds, and then I'm becoming the villain in this story because I need fries. Eli rolled his eyes. You're already the villain in at least 3 people's stories. Only 3. I'm losing my edge. That made Jane laugh for real. The sound surprised her. Not because she had forgotten how. Because it felt so easy. They got in the car. Tessa drove. Eli took the back seat. Jane sat in front and looked out the window as the school building got smaller behind them. She thought she would feel dramatic, triumphant, maybe shaky. Instead she felt clear. Not light exactly. Clear. That was better. The road out of Hawthorne curved past a row of bare trees and a baseball field still half lit by the last of the sun. Parents' cars pulled out in front of them. A crossing guard in a bright vest was still talking to someone by the sidewalk. Normal life kept moving, even after the kind of night that changes something inside you. Tessa tapped the steering wheel. Well, she said. Nobody got arrested. I didn't have to fake a medical event. And your ex looked like a man trying to remember where he left his confidence. I'd call that a strong evening. Jane smiled at the windshield. You have a strange way of measuring success. It works for me. From the back seat, Eli said, You really were good up there, Mom. Jane turned around a little. So were you. He leaned one shoulder against the door. I didn't plan to say anything. I know. I just got tired of hearing him do that thing. Jane looked at him carefully. What thing? Eli made a face like he was annoyed he had to explain something obvious. The way he talks when he wants people to doubt somebody without sounding mean. That landed hard because it was so exact. Tessa let out a low whistle. That's alarmingly accurate. Eli shrugged. He does it all the time. At meetings. At dinners. With coaches. With people at school. He looked down at his hands. He used to do it with you. Jane went quiet. Not because she disagreed. Because hearing your child say out loud what you spent years trying to protect them from can do strange things to your chest. She turned back toward the windshield. Yes, she said softly. He did. Nobody talked for a minute after that. The heater hummed. Tires rolled over patched road. Tessa changed lanes with the irritated confidence of a woman who believed every bad driver was sent to test her patience personally. Then Eli spoke again. I'm not trying to be against him. Jane looked back at him. I know. He's still my dad. I know that too. Eli nodded and stared out the window. It's just, I don't like when people act like they're being fair when they already decided what they want everybody to think. Tessa looked at Jane and then back at the road. Kid, she said. You're going to either become a very good lawyer or a very exhausting journalist. Eli gave the tiniest smile. Maybe both. Jane watched him in the rearview mirror for another second. This was one of the hardest parts of parenting after damage. Not just helping your child heal. Letting them make their own shape out of what happened. Letting them see clearly without handing them your bitterness as a gift. So she said the truest thing she had. You don't have to pick sides to tell the truth. Eli looked at her reflection in the mirror. That's what I was trying to do. I know. Tessa nodded once. And you did it well. They stopped at a burger place 10 minutes later. The kind with sticky floors, bright menu boards, and booths that had seen too many high school teams after games. It smelled like fries, salt, and grilled onions. Perfect. No one at Hawthorne would have called it elegant. Jane loved it instantly. They slid into a booth by the window. Tessa took charge of the order because, in her words, I don't trust either of you to move fast when burgers are on the line. Eli got a double cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate shake. Jane got a single burger and fries she knew she'd end up sharing anyway. When Tessa came back balancing the tray, she looked around the place and sighed. This, she said, setting down the food, is healing. Eli had already reached for a fry. You say that about every meal. Because I keep being right. Jane picked up one fry, then another. For a minute they just ate. No speeches. No heavy processing. Just ketchup packets and paper napkins and the small mercy of hot food after an exhausting day. That, Jane thought, was real life too. Not just the hard moments. The soft landing after. After a while, Eli leaned back and said, So are you going to do it? Jane looked up. Do what? The school expansion. If they approve it. He frowned. They're going to approve it. Tessa pointed a fry at him. That is the correct energy. Jane smiled. If they approve it, she said again. Then yes. Eli nodded like that was the only acceptable answer. That's good. Why? Because it matters. The words were simple. The way he said them was not. Jane looked at him for a second, then glanced down at her burger wrapper so he would not catch the full weight of what that did to her. He had seen, not just tonight. He had seen the years behind tonight. The work, the late nights, the rebuilding. All those evenings when she came home tired and still found the energy to ask about homework, to proofread essays, to leave little notes on the counter if she had an early meeting. He had seen enough to know what mattered. Tessa took a sip of soda. You know what my favorite part was? Jane smiled. This should be good. When Nolan tried that calm little boardroom voice on her, Eli laughed into his shake. Jane groaned. "Please." "No, listen," Tessa said, because he really thought he could wrap it out in a nice blazer and hand it to the room like a gift. And then his own child got up and basically said, "Actually, sir, you are incorrect and also annoying." Eli held up one hand. "I did not say annoying. You implied it spiritually." Jane shook her head, but she was laughing now. Felt nice. Not sharp. Not mean. Just nice. And that was maybe the biggest surprise of the whole evening. For years, Jane had imagined this kind of moment with Nolan as something fiery. Something huge. Something where he got exactly the hurt he handed her all at once, and she finally felt even. But sitting there under bright Burger Place lights with salt on her fingers and her son stealing fries off her tray, she understood something better. Even was never coming. There was no speech he could give that would return those years to her. No apology that could hand back the woman she had been before she learned how easy it was to be erased in polite company. No regret that could fix what Eli saw from that upstairs window. That was the bittersweet part. Some damage changes form, but it does not fully leave. Still, something had closed tonight. Not the past, but the argument the past kept trying to make. That she was not enough on her own. That she had only mattered because Nolan picked her. That being put out with one suitcase meant she had lost. No, all that suitcase really meant was that somebody had guessed wrong about her. Jane reached for her drink and caught her reflection in the dark window beside the booth. Not glowing. Not transformed into one of those perfect revenge stories people like to tell. Just settled. Beautiful in the real way. The way grown women get beautiful when they stop waiting for permission to take up space. Eli noticed her looking and said, "What?" Jane smiled. "Nothing." Tessa squinted at her. "That's a liar face." Jane laughed. "I was just thinking. Dangerous." "I was thinking," Jane said, "that I used to believe one awful night could decide a whole life." Eli leaned forward on his elbows. "And now," Jane looked at him, "now I think one awful night can start a different one." He sat with that, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "that sounds right." After dinner, they walked back out into the cold. The sky had gone fully dark now. Tessa unlocked the car again with that impatient little click. Eli headed to the back seat, but Jane paused for one last second in the parking lot. She looked up, not at anything dramatic, just the sky, the street lights, the breath coming out of her mouth in pale little clouds. Years ago, when she slept on Tessa's pull-out couch with her life in one suitcase and her pride in pieces, she used to lie awake wondering what exactly had broken in her. It took time to understand that the answer was not everything. Some parts of her had broken, yes. Her trust, her ease, her ability to assume love and safety lived in the same house. But other parts had not broken at all. They had sharpened. Her judgment, her endurance, her ability to build slowly and still believe in what she was building. Her understanding of what real love looked like. Not ownership, not image, not a man calling the terms and then calling it protection. Real love looked like Tessa showing up with soup and legal pads. Real love looked like Eli speaking truth in a room full of adults. Real love looked like the life she built after the world expected her to stay ashamed. When they got back into the car, Eli was quiet, already halfway into that tired teenage state where words feel optional. Tessa started the engine. "You want me to stay over?" she asked Jane. "Or are you good?" Jane smiled. "I'm good." Tessa glanced at her once, then nodded. "Yeah," she said. "You are." By the time they got home, the apartment building was quiet except for a TV somewhere on the second floor and the old heater clanking in the hall like it had personal issues. Jane unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was not large. It did not have stone steps or a fountain or perfect lighting in the entryway. What it had was better. Books on the side table. Eli's shoes by the radiator. A grocery list on the fridge. 2 unmatched mugs drying by the sink. A framed drawing from one of the Bright Pages kids that said, "Thank you for helping me like words again." Home. Real home. Eli dropped his backpack by the couch. "I'm taking a shower," he said. And then I'm pretending I don't have homework. Bold plan. I'm a visionary. Jane smiled. 10 minutes. He pointed at her as he walked backward toward the hall. See, now that is oppression. Tessa snorted. The bathroom door closed a second later. Then it was just the two of them in the kitchen. Tessa leaned against the counter and looked at Jane with that sharp old friend gaze that missed nothing. So, she said, how's the heart? Jane let out one long breath. Tired. Yeah. But okay. Tessa nodded once. Better than okay, I think. Jane thought about Nolan in the auditorium. His face when Eli stood up. The way he said, you seem happy. The way she answered, I am. Then she thought about the suitcase. And the church basement. And the little program that became Bright Pages. And tonight. And her son saying, he thought that was the end of your story. And he was wrong. A smile touched Jane's mouth. Yes, she said. Better than okay. Tessa walked over and squeezed her shoulder. You know what I think. Jane raised an eyebrow. That is usually dangerous. But go ahead. I think he finally saw it. Saw what? That he never made you. He just met you before you had to prove yourself to everybody. Jane looked down at the counter for a second. Then back up. Maybe. Tessa grabbed her coat. Call me tomorrow. And if the district delays this decision for some ridiculous reason, I'm writing a letter with so many legal words their heads will spin. You say the sweetest things. I know. She left a minute later, and Jane locked the door behind her. The apartment went still. Not empty. Still. Good still. Jane leaned back against the door and closed her eyes. She could hear the shower running down the hall. A car passing outside. Somebody laughing faintly on the sidewalk below. Ordinary sounds. Precious sounds. She opened her eyes and looked around the room. This life had not been handed back to her. She built it, piece by piece, bill by bill, decision by decision. And maybe that was the real lesson in all of it. Strength does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like paying rent on time after somebody said you couldn't. Sometimes it looks like learning your own worth after somebody worked hard to make you forget it. Sometimes it looks like sitting in a school board meeting, hearing the man who once threw you out try one more time to talk over your life, and realizing his voice no longer reaches the center of you. Nolan would go home that night with his regret. Jane would go to sleep with her peace. That was not justice in the movie sense. It was better. It was real. And real lasts longer. The next morning would come with emails, school forms, coffee, and probably one missing sock because Eli treated laundry like a rumor. Bright Pages would still need funding and planning and people to answer. The district might approve the proposal quickly, or drag its feet like institutions always do when something good asks them to move faster than comfort. But none of that changed the truth. She was not the woman on the driveway anymore. She was the woman who walked back into a room full of power and did not shrink. She was the woman her son defended because he had watched her earn every inch of her life. She was the woman who learned that being underestimated can hurt, but it can also clear the room for a different kind of rise. And maybe you know that feeling too. Maybe somebody looked at your lowest moment and decided that was all you'd ever be. Maybe they mistook your quiet for weakness. Maybe they thought walking away from you, dismissing you, or trying to cut you down would leave you too broken to rebuild. But here's the thing they never understand in time. Some people do their best growing after the door closes. Some people become themselves most fully after the life they planned falls apart. And some endings are only endings if you agree to stop. Jane never did. If the story stayed with you, take a second and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to rebuild after somebody counted you out. And if you want more stories about strength, grace, hard lessons, and people rising after life hits hard, like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Consequential Stories with Benjamin. I'd love to have you here for the next one.